They were not supposed to win. Just over 300 men stood in the open desert, facing an army nearly 3 times their size. The enemy was stronger, better equipped, more prepared. And this wasn't even meant to be a battle. It started as something small, something calculated, but quickly turned into a confrontation no one expected. In just a few hours, everything would change, because what happened at Battle of Badr, that was not just a victory. It was the moment a small, vulnerable group proved they could stand and win. 2 years before this moment, everything had been left behind. The early Muslim community had been forced out of Mecca, their homes, their wealth, their place in society. They migrated to Medina, not as conquerors, but as people rebuilding from loss. Life there was uncertain. They were still small, still vulnerable, and surrounded by forces that did not accept their presence. But tension with Quraysh never disappeared. So when news came of a large Meccan trade caravan returning from Syria, that it presented an opportunity, not for war, but for recovery. The idea was simple: intercept the caravan, reclaim some of what had been taken, apply pressure without open conflict. It was meant to be quick, controlled, but that expectation would collapse. The situation changed before they even reached their target. Abu Sufyan, leading the caravan, understood the risk. He altered his route, avoided interception, and sent a message back to Mecca requesting support. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Quraysh didn't send a small escort. They sent an army. Close to 1,000 men marched out, fully equipped and ready to confront any threat. Meanwhile, the Muslims numbered just over 300. They had limited weapons, few horses, and no preparation for a large-scale battle. What was supposed to be a controlled operation that had now turned into a direct confrontation. And there was no guarantee of survival. Now the reality was clear. This was no longer a mission. It was a battlefield. At this moment, everything slowed. The Barika forward was no longer clear. They could withdraw, return to Medina, avoid the risk, preserve what little strength they had. Or they could stand, face an army nearly 3 times their size, knowing the outcome was uncertain. This was not just a military decision. It was a defining moment, a question of identity, of resolve, of direction. After consultation, the decision was made. They would not retreat. They would hold their ground. Strategically, they moved to the wells of Badr, a crucial position in the desert. Water meant control. Control meant leverage. The smaller force had committed. There would be no second plan, only what came next. The battle did not begin with chaos. It began with silence and tension. Then, as was the custom, champions stepped forward. One-on-one duels opened the confrontation, not to decide the battle, but to shape its psychological start. Each movement mattered. Each outcome sent a message. Then the lines formed. 2 forces facing each other across the desert, one confident in numbers, the other aware of the odds. And then they advanced. The clash was immediate. Weapons struck. Formations tightened. The sound of combat filled the open space. At first, the advantage seemed clear. The larger Quraysh army pressed forward, expecting the smaller force to break under pressure. But it didn't. The Muslims held their positions. Their lines remained intact. Discipline replaced panic. Focus replaced fear. And slowly, something began to shift. Key fighters from Quraysh started to fall. Not randomly, but critically. Men whose presence influenced morale, direction, control. Their loss created gaps, not just in formation, but in confidence. What had begun as a controlled advance started to lose structure. Moments of hesitation appeared, then confusion. And in battle, confusion spreads fast. The smaller force did not collapse. Instead, it adapted, pressing where the lines weakened, holding where pressure increased, turning defense into controlled movement. And then, the shift became visible. The larger army was no longer advancing. It was reacting, then pulling back, then breaking. What began as dominance had turned into retreat. The battlefield had reversed itself. When the fighting ended, the outcome was undeniable. The smaller force had achieved victory, not a narrow escape, not a temporary hold, a decisive result. Many leading figures from Quraysh had fallen. Others were captured. The army that marched out with confidence had been forced into retreat, and the scale of the outcome mattered. Because nothing about the situation suggested this result. Not the numbers, not the preparation, not the expectations. Yet it happened. And that is what gave this moment its weight. It was not just a win. It was an outcome that challenged everything assumed before it. The impact of Badr extended far beyond the battlefield. For the Mushrikeen, everything changed. They were no longer seen as a small, vulnerable group in Medina. They had demonstrated discipline, resilience, and the ability to confront a stronger force and succeed. Confidence grew. Their position strengthened, and their presence became impossible to ignore. Across the region, people began to reassess. This was no longer just a community trying to survive. It was a force capable of shaping events. For Quraysh, the effect was just as significant. This was not simply a loss. It was a disruption, a signal that their control was no longer absolute, that the situation had shifted in a way they could not ignore, and that future confrontations would not be as predictable as before, because Badr was not just a battle. It was a turning point, a moment where the balance changed, and history began moving in a new direction. Some battles are remembered for their scale, others for their impact. Badr was remembered for both, and this was only the beginning, because what follows will push this conflict even further. If you want to follow every step of this story, from survival to expansion to empire, subscribe to the channel.